Welcome to Custom Home Builder Solutions, also known as CHS, a job costing, full accounting, and profit management software for the professional home builder. In this video, we are going to talk about printing checks for bills that you've entered as unpaid and then selected to pay. But before I get started on that, I want to point out a couple of things we'll be using as we print checks. I have opened the chart of accounts real quickly because I'd like you to notice that on our chart of accounts for accounting, we have some things set up on our chart of accounts called cash, BOA, construction, RB, FCU, WTNB. That's actually for West Texas National Bank, etc. That's for our books for this builder. And if you'll notice this little check mark under cash account, these are the ones that are going to be in a drop down to select which cash account that you might be using to print the checks. Now, you might have one of these cash accounts that you use most all of the time to print all of your checks for job costing, or another one for operating, but you might have one that you use most of the time, so you'd like that one to drop in as a default instead of having to select it every time when you're printing checks. So the way you do that is, if you go home, let's go ahead and close this chart of accounts. On the company master, when you're setting up your company, it has some basic things for job and address, but over here there's check printing info in a box. You can select a default bank account, and I've selected our cash WTNB construction because that's the one we use for most all of our job costs and this and that. So I'd like it to drop in as the default when I'm printing checks. When I'm printing checks, I could select a different one, but I'd like this one to drop in for me already. So I selected one. You could leave a 0 in there so that you just have to select the cash account when you print. This is a little pop-up help about selecting that. Now, the default check style, if I drop down here, you're going to see that we have 4 styles designed. Now, we highly recommend and may move to just having the top check 2, which is actually the most commonly used ones. It was designed after the most commonly used ones used by QuickBooks users. And it seems to also be the one that works the best for the people that use that, as far as fitting, getting your printer to fit it, on the checks, etc. So I like it the best. It's what I use for printing my checks, etc. And I'm selecting it as my default check style because that's what I ordered from Dynamic Systems, who is the company that carries checks designed specifically for CHS. And here's their phone number. You can call them to order checks. And like I said, I recommend you start using Top Check 2. But whatever you order, you need to select it here as your default check style, so you won't have to select it every time you're printing checks. And there's a little question mark button about how to test the styles, the various different 4 styles. You could click that and follow some of those ideas for how to just print them on plain paper, etc., to see how they fit and see which ones you might want. But like I said, I would order Top Check 2 from Dynamic Systems for your best results in printing checks. It's always fun to try to get things out of a program to fit exactly on some sorts of forms, and checks are forms, actually. So let's get started in talking about printing checks. You will be going to the unpaid payables window unless you posted some bill and you're quickly doing a check, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But you'd be going to the unpaid payables window. You can see on the home tab that it says select and print checks or post bills as paid. And you'll get a menu that opens. And I'm going to suggest a couple of reports that you might want to print or look at before you actually go to print your checks. A couple of things you might want to review. But first of all, in previous videos, I'm going to open the great big database of unpaid payables. Previous videos, we've talked about using this database for selecting bills to pay in a check run, etc. So I'm not going to go over that very detailed here. But right now, we don't have any selected to pay. So in this case, you could go through and check mark ones you're going to pay, review them, drill down like we've talked about in previous things. In this case, I'm going to decide that our company only prints checks based on ones that have ended up with a check mark in the OK2 column, which means In our company, you could use these any way you want, but in our company, we've said we'll only print checks that the big boss has check marked in the OK2 column. We use the OK2 column for the big boss. Like I said, we've talked before about this window and drilling down to any notes written by the field to us about it before we select, or all notes, or looking at the overages, and that's not what this video is about. But I want to get some selected to pay quickly. So I'm going to say, please select to pay all of them that are yes for OK2. In other words, they're check marked in the OK2 column, and I'm going to select all those that have been okayed by the big boss in our company. I'm going to select all those as to pay in a check run. And it takes a minute to do that and refresh, but now you can see that everything that has an OK2 also has a check mark in the to pay column. So I want to close this window. We've now selected some to pay. And two things you might want to print before printing your checks. Maybe you selected several to pay in the last 2 or 3 days, but you might want to do this report, all unpaid bills with approvals and notes. And you can see the ones that you've selected to pay in red here, and the ones you have not selected just say unpaid here. They're not selected to pay. But you might want to print this report out or export it to PDF and take a look to see if there's any new notes or anything written that you need to know about before you run these checks. That's just up to you whether you want to do that or not, but it's a good report that'll show you all notes that have been written, maybe if you have people put a little date on their note, so you can sort of review it so you feel comfortable about all the ones that you have marked to pay being okay to pay. The other good one you might want to print before you print checks is this all bills selected to pay. So it's just a list of only the ones that you've selected to pay, and by printing that you can see what the total of your checks will come out to, how much will be printed for each vendor, the total of their check that they print. You can see all of that and review it if you need to before printing your checks. Another one, if you just do all unpaid payables, maybe you think, well, did I miss any I need to pay? You could look at ones that still say unpaid and wonder, should I go ahead and pay these or should I not, or that kind of thing. You might want to print that because it's easy to see which ones you selected and which ones are in there that will not be included because they just have unpaid in black there. That means you haven't selected them to pay. So there's some reports to review before you do your great big check run if you need to. You might already know what you're doing and don't need any of those reports. But there's two ways to print checks. We're going to use this button here in a minute, but you can also, while you're on that unpaid payables, and we'll let it come in again for us, because I should have mentioned it while I had it open, but maybe you've sat here and you've selected a whole bunch to pay and you're ready to print the checks, then you could use a button from right here to go ahead and print the checks that you've checkmarked to pay. But if you've checkmarked a bunch in the last few days or this morning and closed that window, you can just use this button on the menu without waiting for this one to open again to take a look at it to print checks. So we're ready to print our checks. Then the first window that opens when you click to print checks is one for you to do some filtering. Maybe you've selected a whole bunch to pay, but right now you're only wanting to print a check for one vendor. You could do ABC Foundation, say I only want for that one, from that one to that one, and I want to submit my filters. And then I can see down here it's showing all the records that will be used to print checks. In other words, it would only print one check to ABC Foundation if I continue to print checks. Let's clear the filters. The other thing, maybe you have different departments or divisions that you've set up. This builder only has 2. It hasn't set up any like spec or remodeling, and maybe you use a different checking account for those different divisions or departments. So maybe you only want to print checks for some particular department. You can see that these invoices have departments on them. Or maybe you just want to print checks for subcontractor types or different vendor types, suppliers only, just different reasons, or just all checks just that have one particular job. So that's why this filter opens, because you may have selected a whole bunch to pay, but all of a sudden, like I say, you're just wanting to do one for one vendor. You don't want to have to go uncheck all your to pay ones. So this is a way to filter down and just say, for right now, I'm just printing these checks. But we're going to print the checks for all of them, so I'm going to clear the filters there, and then I'll submit the filters again, so they'll all come back in to show me, what all invoices are going to be paid. And I could do a report of the filtered records if I wanted to, of what it is I'm going to pay, which is essentially a list again of all these things that we saw already. But a good lot of the times, if you're going to do your big print check run, this window will open and you might ignore all of this, and then you would just do continue. You would also use continue if you had filtered them. So we're going to continue to print checks. We're going to print checks for everything we've check marked to pay in our case. Notice that some of these windows can be dragged down if you feel like something's falling off the bottom. So this window will open because it needs some information. Now remember, at the first of the video I talked about how on the company master you can tell it to drop in a default cash account. This is the account that the checks are written on. If you do that, be aware that you did it. Always pay attention to this cash account field and don't accidentally post all these checks to a cash account you don't want. You should just look at it. If it's the default one you want, you don't have to drop down and select one of your cash accounts here. It'll drop in, and maybe that's the account you use all the time. You should still pay attention to it. And then the default check style that we selected on the company master has dropped in. Maybe if you're doing you have 2 or 3 different types of checks you've ordered for CHS for different checking accounts, you might have to select a different check style depending on what check style that you are putting into your printer for this bank. So that's why you have a drop down here to select that. Excuse me. Now here you can either use the calendar or type in a date that is the check date. Today's date will just automatically drop in, which is probably the date you're using because it's the date you're printing the checks. But there may be some other reason you want some different date on it. It will give you an error. If I put in February 28th, it's not going to let me print the checks because it's going to find invoices that I've selected to pay as after that, and it will end up popping up and telling you that when you go to print checks. You can't use a date that's earlier than any of the invoice dates that you entered, because it makes your accounts payable aging get off and act wacky. It needs to have the check on the date you enter the invoice or after. So anyway, you should also be sure there's 4 digits for the year. The web just behaves better if we tell it precisely what year without using 2 digits. The beginning check number, I have a tip here that I'd like you to pay attention to the first couple of times you're doing your work. I have a suggestion, from all my classes in accounting and this and that you keep track of all the checks that are printed, because you can print a list of the checks that you just printed after you print these checks, and that you maybe keep those lists in your running list of checks for a bank account in maybe some notebook. And before entering, maybe now you've picked up your stack of checks and you say my starting check number is this, you might want to look at your notebook to see if it's the check after your last check number that you have stored, you have recorded in CHS, just to make sure somebody didn't go get a check that's missing that you need to maybe investigate. So this is a good internal control spot as you're thinking about what beginning check number you're going to put in. You can also click this button, which I use doing demos. I'm sorry for the dog again. And you can see these are actually in descending order, so I can see the last check that was used was voided 3045, 3044. This is just a weird thing that I did for some reason with some weird number in a demo, but anyway, they're in descending order, so you can see the latest check number issued on that checking account. And if CHS, let's say I picked up my stack of checks and the first check in it is something like 3048, I might be saying, what happened to 3046 and 3047? So you don't really have to have these printouts of check lists in a notebook, because there is a button here where you can look and see if there might be any missing checks. But this is a good time before doing a big check run and before entering your beginning check number. We're actually going to go ahead and use 3046. We'll say none are missing. And when we picked up our stack of checks, that was the first one in the pile that will be printed. Your checks, it totally depends on your printer how your checks are stacked and how you put them in, and you'll have to play with that. Different printers are different. They'll feed from the bottom or feed from the top, and flip first, head first, but that's going to have to be up to you to make sure that you test one that it's feeding through your printer okay. We also have important information over here about printing checks, about how you should set. There's also this link that you can click for how to set up Firefox, your browser, for your best bet for printing checks in CHS, etc. So you need to pay attention to these instructions so that you get your best bet for fitting. You need to do things when you open the PDF, and we'll talk about that in a second, like make sure things are set to actual size, etc. There's also an alert down here. Be sure to close the PDF window after printing checks. This is so that a window will pop up to post the checks or not. In case your checks snag this and that, just because you open the thing to print checks doesn't mean that CHS knows anything about whether they printed okay, whether they snagged, whether they clogged up in your printer, whether you got something wrong when you did it. So once you close the PDF that's about to open, CHS is going to ask, did they print okay, and do you want to post them? So you need to be sure right now when you open this thing to print checks, which is going to open, in some cases, depending on how you set up your Firefox, it may just go ahead and open your PDF reader that you have on your machine, because you may have told PDFs to open that way. If you haven't set Firefox to do that, you're going to get this little PDF type of window that the software I use provides, and you may try printing from it and maybe things will fit just fine, but sometimes you have better luck if you go ahead and download to your own PDF reader before you print it. Sometimes your PDF reader will honor and send to the printer the exact information as I've designed these checks. You can see that there's the check part here. This is top check 2, and the 2 stubs are going to be printing on each check, and that we have 13 checks. So you could, if you didn't know how many checks to put in the printer, you could open this and look at the number of pages, and then that'll let you know how many checks you need to put in the printer if you need to count them before you put them in. And also pay close attention to the check printing instructions after the checks print. Close this window just like I said. When you click your printer icon and the printer dialog box opens, let's do that on this one. But let's go ahead and I'll show you how the download happens. It knows that when I do a download, I want my Adobe Acrobat to open this. So now we have it open as a PDF here. And if I click my printer icon, it's going to open up a print box based on my printer. So yours may look different, but I'd like you to notice that you need to have actual size, not fit. You don't want to shrink. You don't want to make it pretty. You don't want to have any auto things going on. You might look at your advanced and your properties. You want to make sure that you're not rotating things, that kind of thing. But you want actual size, and you want your printer will have some different options. So you need to sort of look around at the various things here and make sure that you have portrait, and that you're just not letting it size to fit so that your reader is trying to make it all pretty. We want it to be the size that I programmed it. So you do need to check all these things. I don't know if I have anything for this printer in advance that matters. I don't think so. But you might need to drill down on some buttons to take an extra look at it. And if you need to test it, you could just tell it to print one page by using Pages and print one. Print it on a plain piece of paper, hold it up to your check to see if it seems to be fitting on your checks just fine. But printers kind of rule here, so it's hard for us, your printer takes over what you're printing and might try to do things to stuff. So that's why we have all the instructions about that. I'm going to cancel this. I'm actually not. I'm going to play like I clicked the print button, and mine have all now printed on checks. And so I'm going to close my PDF reader and close the one opened by the program. And this is real important, that you don't put your checks on to run and walk away from your machine while they're running, or let it sit idle for 30 minutes. Because if you do and your browser closes down, you won't get this question. Because your browser all closed down and you're out of the thing. So you want to be sure that you stay around, watch that your checks are printing okay, or if you need to leave or answer a phone real quick, you just keep your screen alive so that you get to this point. You wouldn't want to print a whole bunch of checks that never get posted as paid in CHS. That wouldn't be good. They just stay in a to-pay status and somebody else might come along and print them, so that'd be really not good. Although CHS catches that happens, and I'm going to show that in another video. It actually is not going to let you have that happen without taking care of it, because that's too dangerous. So it'll block you if you never got to this point. If you open to print the checks and you never answered yes to post them or no, do not post them, it's going to block you from posting more checks until you do a little bit of maintenance, and there's instructions for that. But I'm going to go ahead and say yes, the checks ran okay, so post them as paid. And the next window that comes up is going to tell me what my cash balance is in the cash account that I had selected for printing those checks. It's going to show me what my cash balance is after those checks have been deducted from the cash balance. And this is the thing right here. It says list all checks with the same date, which is these checks. It's today that we printed. That was at a same amount as that original report we printed. And if you want the detail behind this list of checks, maybe you printed that original report of bills selected to pay. You might want to staple them together for whatever reason. Although you can drill down to the detail on the list of checks window, etc., behind checks and print that kind of report with the detail behind the checks, the invoices paid. But this is something I'm saying you might put in a notebook where you're just watching your check numbers, to make sure that no checks end up missing, etc. So that's all there is to printing a big batch of checks. I want to see how long this video has been. I think what I'll do is stop this video, and my very next video is going to be about how you can print one check on the fly or post something as paid. Maybe you wrote a manual check, etc. for that. And my next video will be about either printing one check on the fly when you enter a bill right away, or from this unpaid payables window, one check for one vendor, or posting something as paid because somebody hand wrote the check. All right, thank you for watching, and please watch the next video.